It's a great honor to chosen to be the luncheon speaker, and I want to explain the uniqueness of Ludwig von Mises. The 20th century has been the century of socialism and of total war, of Bolshevism, of National Socialism, and most enduringly of social democracy or American-style liberalism and neoconservatism. And it has been the century of countless economic ruin as well as almost 200 million deaths. One man above all for his entire life has stood as a bulwark against the zeitgeist of the 20th century. And that is Ludwig von Mises with his paradigm of a free and prosperous commonwealth, that is, of capitalism and freedom and peace. Two of the three variants of socialism that Mises stood against, National Socialism and Bolshevism, have by now suffered their well-deserved fate and collapsed as Mises had long before predicted. Despots and democratic majorities, Mises explained, are drunk with power. They must reluctantly admit that they are subject to the laws of nature, but they reject the very notion of economic law. Are they not the supreme legislators? Don't they have the power to crush every opponent? No warlord is prone to acknowledge any limits other than those imposed on him by a superior armed force. Economic history is a long record of government policies that failed because they were designed with a bold disregard for the laws of economics. Both National Socialism and Bolshevism, Mises explained, were such systems designed in bold disregard of the nature of man and economics. Under Bolshevism, all plants, shops, and farms are formally nationalized. They are departments of the government operated by civil servants. Every unit of the apparatus of production stands in the same relation to the superior central organization as does the local post office to the postmaster general. Under National Socialism, the private ownership of the means of production is nominally preserved. There are, however, no longer entrepreneurs, but only shop managers. These shop managers are bound to obey unconditionally the orders issued by the government's Supreme Office of Production Management. This office tells the shop managers what and how to produce, at what prices and from whom to buy, at what prices and to whom to sell. It assigns every worker to his job and fixes his wages. It decrees to whom and on what terms the capitalists must entrust their funds. Market exchange is merely a sham. All the wages, prices, and interest rates are fixed by the government. They are wages, prices, and interest rates in appearance only. In fact, they are merely quantitative terms in the government's orders determining a citizen's job, income, consumption, and standard of living. Both systems, Mises explained, wanted above all to engage in economic planning. However, in fact, they were no systems of economic planning at all. In the absence of real prices for production factors, no economic calculation is possible. Input prices cannot be compared to output prices, and hence permanent misallocation of production factors, that is, economic chaos, had to result. Now, we don't have to worry anymore about Russian or German-style socialism, at least not for the time being. What is left today is only the third variety of socialism, that is, social democracy or democratic capitalism, or what Mises has termed interventionism. Mises says tax-supported universities are under the sway of the party in power. The authorities try to appoint only professors who are ready to advance ideas of which they themselves approve. As all non-socialist governments are today firmly committed to interventionism, they appoint only interventionists. In their opinion, the first duty of the university is to sell this official social philosophy to the rising generation. Now, what is this third system? This is how Mises characterizes it. The interventionist doctrinaires repeat again and again that they do not plan the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, of entrepreneurial activities, and of market exchange. But, of course, all these advocates of a middle-of-the-road policy emphasize with the same vigor that they reject Manchesterism and laissez-faire liberalism. It is necessary, they say, that the state interfere with the market phenomena whenever and wherever the free play of economic forces results in conditions that appear as socially undesirable. That means the market is free as long as it does precisely what the government wants it to do. It is free to do what the authorities consider to be the right things, but not to do what they consider to be the wrong things. The decision concerning what is right and what is wrong rests with government. That is the third system. Now, what is Mises' verdict on this third system? Before I want to tackle this question, however, it is appropriate to illustrate Mises' claim regarding the prevalence of interventionism in today's academy. To show the dominance of interventionism in academia, one can do no better than take the examples of the two nowadays most prominent so-called free market economists, namely Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. To be sure, both Friedman and Hayek have a better appreciation of the potentialities of private property and of free markets than most other economists, not to speak of social scientists in general. However, both of them also have been co-opted by the powers that be. Indeed, there are few government leaders who do not say highly complimentary things about Hayek and Friedman, while Mises is characteristically ignored. Both Hayek and Friedman are, if you want, establishment libertarians, defining, so to speak, the limits of what today is regarded as responsible talk. That is why it is particularly revealing to show how wholeheartedly even they have swallowed the principle of interventionism. According to Hayek, government is necessary to fulfill the following tasks, not merely for law enforcement and defense against external enemies, but, I quote, in an advanced society, government ought to use its powers of raising funds by taxation to provide a number of services which for various reasons cannot be provided or cannot be provided adequately by the market. Now, a brief comment on this, since at all times an infinite number of tasks and goods is not provided by the market. Hayek here basically gives the government a blank check. Among these are protection against violence, epidemics, or such natural forces as floods and avalanches, but also many of the amenities which make life in modern cities tolerable. Most roads, the provision of standards of measure, and of many kinds of information ranging from land registers, maps, and statistics to the certification of the quality of some goods or services offered in the market. Additional government functions are the assurance of a certain minimum income for everyone. Government should distribute its expenditures over time in such a manner that it will step in when private investment flags. It should finance schools and research, as well as enforce building regulations, pure food laws, the certification of certain professions, the restrictions on the sale of certain dangerous goods, such as arms, explosives, and so forth, as well as some safety and health regulation for the process of production and the provision of such institutions as theaters, sports grounds, and so forth. And it should make use of the power of eminent domain in order to enhance the public good. Moreover, according to Hayek, it generally holds that there is some reason to believe that with the increase in general wealth and the density of population, the share of all needs that can be satisfied only by collective action will continue to grow. In his Constitution of Liberty, Hayek wants government to provide further for monetary stability. Government should implement an extensive system of compulsory insurance, which he calls coercion, intended to forestall greater coercion. Public subsidized housing is a possible government task. Likewise, city planning and zoning were considered appropriate government functions, provided that the sum of the gains must exceed the sum of the losses. And lastly, the provision of amenities of or opportunities for recreation, or the preservation of natural beauty or of historical sites or places of scientific interest, national parks, nature reservations, and so on, were regarded as government tasks according to Hayek. Now, what social democrat or neoconservative would argue with this lengthy list of government functions? Nor can they complain about Milton Friedman. His list is shorter but hardly less extensive. According to Friedman, not only internal and external defense are government tasks. Government, supported in the main by income taxes, is responsible to break up market monopolies. Government guarantees a minimum income, the so-called negative income tax proposal. Government is in charge of macroeconomic planning, and its central bank in particular is charged with the issue of fiat money and the task of monetary stabilization. And then there is the open sesame clause for government intervention of neighborhood effects. According to Friedman, it is legitimate for government to interfere with the outcome of the free market whenever anyone's actions have neighborhood effects. That is, if A does something that will benefit B, and B does not have to pay for it, Friedman considers this to be a market defect. And it is then the task of the government to correct this defect by taxing B to pay A for this benefit. Thus, the funding of public education, that is Friedman's voucher program, is allegedly a government function. Likewise, the funding of urban parks is to be entrusted to government. But as it is easy to see, this neighborhood effect argument lends itself to endless possibilities for government intervention, even if Friedman does not recognize all of them. For instance, egalitarian income redistribution can be and has been claimed as lowering all-around crime rates and hence be justified on neighborhood effect grounds. Likewise, all sorts of compulsory social insurance schemes can be so justified, as Friedman cannot but admit, at least implicitly, namely by arguing that otherwise, without these compulsory insurance schemes, the uninsured would become public charges. This, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, is as good as it gets in today's academic establishment. Or more precisely, this is as good as it gets in economics departments. Matters are far worse in other fields such as philosophy, history, sociology, political science, and literature. Now on to Mises and his very different paradigm of capitalism and peace. To take the first cornerstone of the interventionist program, equally endorsed by Hayek and Friedman, namely a government-guaranteed minimum income. Mises rejects this. He writes, "No civilized community has callously allowed the incapacitated to perish, but the substitution of a legally enforceable claim to support or sustenance for charitable relief does not seem to agree with human nature as it is. Not metaphysical prepossessions, but considerations of practical expediency make it inadvisable to promulgate an actionable right to sustenance. Charitable activity must be private and voluntary, and a capitalist society would surely be a wealthy one affording these sorts of tasks." Moreover, Mises emphasizes that compulsory welfare and all forms of social insurance are counterproductive. That is, they lead to more of the very problem, that is poverty and public charges, that they were intended to solve. He writes, "The destructionist aspect of accident and health insurance lies above all in the fact that such institutions promote accidents and illness, hinder recovery, and very often create, or at least intensify and lengthen, the functional disorders which follow illness or accident. To feel healthy is quite different from being healthy in the medical sense. By weakening or completely destroying the will to be well and to be able to work, social insurance creates illness and inability to work. It produces the habit of complaining, which is in itself a neurosis, and neuroses of other kinds. In short, it is an institution which tends to encourage disease, not to say accidents and illnesses. As a social institution, it makes a people sick bodily and mentally, or at least helps to multiply, lengthen, and intensify disease. Social insurance has thus made the neurosis of the insured a dangerous public disease. Should the institution be extended and developed, the disease will spread. No reform can be of any assistance. We cannot weaken or destroy the will to health without producing illness." Now, who is proven right on the issue of government welfare? The interventionists Hayek, or Friedman, and others going far further than they do, or Mises? I would think the answer seems to be quite clear if we just simply look at the world. Secondly, both Hayek and Friedman support a system of compulsory public education. of government-operated or funded schools. Mises, who grew up under multicultural conditions of the Habsburg Empire, rejects the second cornerstone of the interventionist view as incompatible with peaceful relationships between people of different languages, religion, nationality, and ethnicity. He writes, "In all areas of mixed nationality, the school is a political prize of the highest importance. It cannot be deprived of its political character as long as it remains a public and compulsory institution. There is, in fact, only one solution. The state, the government, the laws must not in any way concern themselves with schooling or education. Public funds must not be used for such purposes. The rearing and instruction of youth must be left entirely to parents and to private associations and institutions." Moreover, Mises recognizes government control of education cannot but lead to indoctrination. He writes, "As soon as one wants to go farther than reading, writing, and arithmetic, serious difficulties arise. Teaching at the elementary level necessarily turns into indoctrination. The party that operates the schools is in a position to propagandize its tenets and to disparage those of other parties. The problem does not refer only to the teaching of religion and of certain theories of the natural sciences at variance with the Bible. It concerns even more the teaching of history and economics." Now again, who is right on the issue of education? Hayek, Friedman, and the interventionists, or Mises? As it turns out, ever more people recognize the truth of Mises' insight into the need of separating school and the state completely. Thirdly, both Hayek and Friedman advocate a government role with regard to money. At least the early Hayek did. Friedman in particular, as his admired predecessor Irving Fisher, has been a lifelong foe of commodity money. That is, the international gold standard, and has been an advocate of freely fluctuating national fiat monies issued by a monopolistic central bank intent upon monetary stabilization. That is, the production of money of all goods is under the total and exclusive control of the government. Mises is vigorously opposed to all of this. He points out that no such thing as a price level exists. All price indices are scientifically arbitrary, and hence the task of monetary stabilization is futile. But more importantly, how can a government-produced fiat money, totally cut loose from gold, be considered compatible with a free market? Indeed, the results of such an institutional setup can be readily predicted. Suppose Smith has the monopoly power to print money. What will he do? He will print it virtually out of thin air, and then he will turn around to buy real assets with this money, thus enriching himself as any plain counterfeiter does at the expense of others. That is, the result of government paper money is permanent inflation and a steady decline in the purchasing power of money. To be sure, Friedman advises the central bank not to be too inflationary, just 3 or 4% per year. But how naive do you have to be to believe that this could work? People do not become angels upon becoming central bankers. The temptation to enrich oneself by means of legal counterfeiting is, practically speaking, irresistible. Again, just look around you. Now, what is Mises's advice instead? The total separation of government and money, a market-produced international gold money. Mises is, of course, aware of the interventionist arguments. He writes, "The nationalists are fighting the gold standard because they want to sever their countries from the world market and to establish national autarky as far as possible. Interventionist governments and pressure groups are fighting the gold standard because they consider it the most serious obstacle to their endeavors to manipulate prices and wage rates. But the most fanatical attacks against gold are made by those intent upon credit expansion. With them, credit expansion is a panacea for all economic ills. It could lower or even entirely abolish interest rates, raise wages and prices for the benefit of all except the parasitic capitalists and the exploiting employers, free the state from the necessity of balancing its budget, in short, make all decent people prosperous and happy. Only the gold standard, that devilish contrivance of the wicked and stupid orthodox economists, prevents mankind from everlasting prosperity." Now, not so, explains Mises. The significance of the fact that the gold standard makes the increase in the supply of gold dependent upon the profitability of producing gold is, of course, that it limits the government's power to resort to inflation. The gold standard makes the determination of money's purchasing power independent of the changing ambitions and doctrines of political parties and pressure groups. This is not a defect of the gold standard. It is its main excellence. The gold standard removes the determination of cash-induced changes in the purchasing power from the political arena. Its general acceptance requires the acknowledgement of the truth that one cannot make all people richer by printing money. The abhorrence of the gold standard is inspired by the superstition that omnipotent governments can create wealth out of scraps of paper. Moreover, just as private, non-governmental education is a requirement for peaceful relations among linguistically, religiously, or ethnically heterogeneous populations, so a privately market-produced international gold money is a requirement for peaceful international relations. In contrast, any national money and monetary national policies disintegrates international markets and the division of labor, and hence causes resentment and conflict. And government-issued fiat currencies, in contrast to gold money, greatly facilitates war finance. The money can simply be printed up, and hence international conflicts escalate more likely to war. Now, who is right on the issue of money? Friedman and the monetary interventionists, or Mises? Again, the question is obviously only rhetorical. Last but not least, the question must be raised of how to limit the power of the state from expanding beyond its legitimate functions, whatever they may be. Now, Hayek and Friedman share a naive view of a benevolent government. Government is viewed as the indispensable provider of some vaguely defined public good, or of liberty or of freedom, and as self-constrained by means of constitutions and intra-institutional checks and balances. In distinct contrast, Mises' view of government is hard-nosed and realistic. He writes, "It is important to remember," and this is something very unlike what you would ever hear from Hayek or Friedman. "It is important to remember that government interference always means violent action or the threat of such action. The funds that a government spends for whatever purposes are levied by taxation. And taxes are paid because the taxpayers are afraid of offering resistance to the tax gatherer. They know that any disobedience or resistance is hopeless. As long as this is a state of affairs, the government is able to collect the money that it wants to spend. Government is in the last resort the employment of armed men, of policemen, gendarmes, soldiers, prison guards, and hangmen. The essential feature of government is the enforcement of its decrees by beating, killing, and imprisoning. There exists, according to Mises, only one legitimate task of government, and that is the protection of private property from invasion or depredation by anti-social aggressors. Only anti-social aggressors may be beaten, killed, or imprisoned. The program of liberalism, writes Mises, if condensed into one single word, would have to read property, that is, private property of the means of production. All other demands of liberalism result from this fundamental demand. But how to prevent government from doing something other than protecting private property? How to prevent that government becomes an aggressor? How to prevent it from assuming such tasks as income and wealth redistribution, education, and money? This is only possible, Mises explains, if and insofar as there exists a recognized right to unlimited secession. He writes, the right of self-determination in regard to the question of membership in a state thus means whenever the inhabitants of a particular territory, whether it be a single village, a whole district, or a series of adjacent districts, make it known by a freely conducted plebiscite that they no longer wish to remain united to the state to which they belong at the time, but wish either to form an independent state or attach themselves to some other state, their wishes are to be respected and complied with. This is the only feasible and effective way of preventing revolutions and civil and international wars. If it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination to every individual person, it would have to be done. That is, Mises' answer to the question of how to tame the state is essentially by reducing it to the rank of a voluntary membership organization. And implied in this answer is also a prediction. To the extent that a state does not permit secession, it will move ever more away from its task as a private property protector and become increasingly totalitarian. And again, who is correct on the limits of state growth? Hayek and Friedman and the interventionists, or Mises? Again, what a question. Hayek and Friedman cannot but be considered starry-eyed, whereas Mises provides a perfect explanation for the development of the United States since 1861, that is, the time when the right of secession was violently suppressed, and we saw then a rapid growth in the power of the state. Under Bolshevism and National Socialism, Mises' books were banned and his life would have been in danger. And yet the events have proven him right. Under interventionist conditions, Mises could survive and work. However, except for a few years in Switzerland from 1934 to 1940, he was prevented from ever acquiring a regular academic post. And while Hayek and Friedman have been Nobel prized, and their views can be heard everywhere, Mises and his writings have been dismissed or ignored by the academic establishment to this day. And yet, also his predictions concerning interventionism become reality before our eyes. But one must go outside of academia, or the mainstream of academia. One must go to the Mises Institute to hear these truths. That middle-of-the-road socialism, too, is contrary to the nature of man and economics, and that it is also bound to collapse, and that only private property and laissez-faire capitalism can produce prosperity and peace. Let me toast to Mises, the greatest economist of the 20th century, and Lew Rockwell, the brilliant intellectual entrepreneur who made all of this possible. Thank you.